I need to be fundamentally confident actually in order to show up with a growth mindset and in order to show up with humility. Because only if I'm fundamentally confident that I have a strong sense of self, can I actually take those risks? Can I ask you, give me some feedback on how I'm doing? So can I actually display humility and admit that I'm not perfect because I have mistakes, I have flaws, because I fundamentally have a strong sense of self.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season includes 25 incredible episodes devoted to the inner development goals. Based on the science of personal transformation, the IDG framework represents 23 skills needed for today's world. And of course, empathy is one of them. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Dr. Urs Koenig, one of the world's foremost experts on humble leadership and the best-selling author of Radical Humility. He's a former UN peacekeeper and NATO peacekeeping commander, an ultra-endurance champion, a widely published professor, and a seasoned executive coach with more than 3 decades of experience guiding leaders and teams to new levels of success across 4 continents. Urs is the founder of the Radical Humility Leadership Institute and has inspired organizations worldwide, including Amazon, Starbucks, Microsoft, and many more. I've invited Urs to join this special IDG series because his work exemplifies the humility trait within the Inner Development Goals framework. So welcome to the show, Urs.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. That's not a humble introduction, by the way. Not humble at all, right?
Fair enough. I appreciate that. I always like beginning these conversations by learning a little bit about the guest, and I find the backstories super interesting, what brought you to this passion work that you're doing. So I guess my first question is, what do you think you'd want to share with readers and viewers about yourself and your backstory that brings today's conversation into the foreground?
Absolutely. So I'm a leadership guy. I live and breathe and speak on and write on and talk about leadership. So throughout my life as an academic many years ago, a consultant, executive coach, ultra endurance athlete in the military, I was always drawn to how do we get the most out of our people. And you mentioned in the intro, I was an executive coach for a long time. I still do a little bit of coaching. And so I discovered sort of humility as a leadership trait probably about 10 years ago. I was always drawn to humble people in my personal life, like those who are super successful, but still, seemingly ask the dumb questions or say, I actually am not sure about this. Let me go and find out. In my ultra cycling career, I was always drawn to people who let their legs do the talking versus the big mouth. And so I always loved humble folks. But then just right after the financial crisis, as an executive coach, I found my clients being always seemingly a step behind. And a lot of them were still leading very much top-down command control. So that sort of got me asking, we need to look at different ways to lead. And then at the same time, Peter and Ed Shine published their, in my field, groundbreaking book, Humble Leadership. And I sort of honestly, almost coincidentally, discovered that book. And that's it. That's the answer. And I started to dig into the humble leadership literature a bit. But then on a personal level, you mentioned in the intro, I was as a peacekeeper. So 7 years ago, I was in Kosovo for NATO for a peacekeeping mission. And then 3 years ago, I was in the Middle East, in Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, and Egypt for a year for the UN. And surprisingly, going back into the military, into what everybody thinks is top-down command control, just do what I say because I say so, actually made me realize that the best commanders, the best leaders are deeply humble leaders. So my peacekeeping missions were really the catalyst for me to then really seriously dive into the humble leadership literature. And then, I wrote a book on it and now I speak on it almost exclusively. So that's my little winding path to discovering and now being super passionate about humility in leadership.
And I promise to get back to some of the big leaders on the scene right now, out in the world, what you think about them, or how you think they emulate radical humility or not. But first, we got to unpack a little bit in your work and in your book. And I'm going to start with the inner development goals itself, because they define humility as being able to act in accordance with the needs of the situation without concern for one's own importance. So I wonder if you could speak to whether that resonates for you or what you might want to add or layer into that.
Look, it definitely resonates. Unsurprisingly, I would define humility a bit broader, but I think it totally resonates. So when I read this and you sent me this beforehand, I looked at it, and the first thing that came to mind was let the best idea win, not yours. Right? So, how do I, as a leader, display the humility to make sure that indeed, the best idea wins and not mine, so that, in accordance with the needs of the situation versus my own need to be the smartest and the one who always has the answers. What also, as I read this, came up for me, which I am feeling very passionate about and write in my book and talk about this concept of a leadership factory, meaning as a leader, making it my explicit goal to for my team to produce the next generation of leaders. And so that is, we all face talent shortage. We can't hold our people, but actually taking pride on our people becoming smarter and moving on to bigger and greener pastures away from our team. So taking pride in the success of my people, even when they move on. And so that sort of came up for me as well when I read your definition. I would, define it a bit broader. So I think one aspect is, and that's what people often think of when they think of humility. I see myself in line with how others see me, which, by the way, doesn't mean I see myself lower or certainly not higher, right? So in line with how others see me. And then, one core element of how I define leadership, humble leadership, it's a more relational kind of leading versus simply by content expertise, right? And so I would add to that. And then, the growth mindset, which we can chat about, that's sort of how do I look at my setbacks and mistakes as an opportunity for learning and growing versus being ashamed of them or versus sweeping them under the carpet. So I tie that in as well into the humble leadership definition.
And I know we're going to go deeper into your definition and the pillars or characteristics that make for radical humility. I want to go back to the book title because it really caught my attention. The title is Radical Humility. The subtitle is Be a Badass Leader and a Good Human. It really caught my attention. It's kind of I thought, a very effective subtitle. So I want to know what motivated you to write your book. Talk about the subtitle, why that subtitle is important to you, and what you hope readers will get from reading the book.
So I think the book was sort of I've been told for years that I should write a book like many of us have. And like, I don't, honestly, I'm very transparent about this. I always felt, the cynic in me goes, I'm not going to write another leadership book, says the same thing, nobody reads anyway, whatever. But then I actually did feel when I came back from my second peacekeeping mission that now I have a bit of a unique lens, right? So weaving in my peacekeeping experience, my ultra sports experience. And so that's what motivated me to write the book. And frankly, I mean, this is an aside. I felt, I wrote the book as much for everybody else out there because I'm passionate about the message and I truly believe radically humble leaders can make for a better world. I truly believe that. It also was something, I wanted to sort of have a tangible product in my hand. So it was a little that thing for, even for my boys. I have two teenage boys, like, my dad wrote a book, and there's something tangible there. So that's the motivation around writing the book. So the title, look, I advocate for humility because yes, it's the right thing to do by our people. It's the right thing to have self-awareness. It's the right thing to lead relationally. It's the right thing to see our people as whole human beings versus just worker bees. But I don't advocate for it because of only that. I advocate for it because I strongly believe that today's world actually requires it. If you think about it, leading today is by definition humbling. you as the boss can never have all the answers because our people are so specialized. They need to go so deep into their area of expertise. You will never understand everything or know how to do their job. So what you need from them is the trust that they share the information you so clearly need as a leader, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the only way they'll trust you to share everything that's going on is if you've built meaningful and collaborative relationships with them. If you admit to them that, I don't have all the answers, I need them from you. And so I'm very clear, humble leadership is not about being soft. It's not about being cozy. It's not about standing around in a circle, holding hands, singing kumbaya. It's what's required to win these days. And, psychological safety is part of how I define humble leadership. There's plenty of very rigorous academic research, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that shows that psychologically safe teams outperform other teams by a factor of 10x and more. And so again, this notion that we either have to be a kind person or a kind leader, or a badass leader, like it's a false dichotomy. We can all do hard stuff in a very human way. And by the way, and I talk about this in the book, sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to let somebody go. We can do it in the right way, but the most loving thing. So it doesn't mean shying away from hard decisions. It doesn't mean shying away from tough calls at all. So that's why good human and badass leader, because it helps us to achieve results.
And you believe that you can become a more humble leader. Radical humility is something that you can develop you believe that.
I do. I mean, look, that's a very macro question. If I wouldn't believe that all of us can change to some extent, I mean, we can just hang up our hat and be done, right? So I absolutely believe that is something that we can develop. And look, I speak to a lot of very blue collar industries. I just gave a keynote last month to roofers, to painters. So, mainly male, mainly older, and, it can be a tough crowd. But when you peel away the layers, it actually really resonates with them as well. So even people who, feel maybe they're a bit set in their ways, or people that you and I feel might not be as willing to change, are actually willing to look at that. And, this is not very humble of me to say, but because of my background, like the military, the ultra sports, I can sort of bring that message to them, and they can hear it. So to answer your question, very directly, I absolutely believe that's something we can all learn, and it's teachable.
So let's pull back the layers. Your radical humility embraces three tenets. They are self-knowledge, relationships, and a growth mindset. And it centers on making 5 shifts to move from what I think you call heroic to humble. So could you unpack all of that? And if you want to use examples, case studies to do so, by all means.
Right. In like 2 minutes. So exactly, right.
Okay.
So yeah, it all starts really with what I call digging deep. So this is the self-knowledge. So it's about seeing as I said earlier, myself in line with how others see me. And what I need to do there is, people often ask me, so what's the first thing I need to do? I think of this as an iterative process. It's going out in the world and asking my team members, hey, Anita, I want to become better at delegating. What suggestions do you have for me? Give me some feedback on how I'm doing. So this is out in the world, checking how I'm coming across, where I can do better. And then I'm a huge fan of introspection, going back. My way of introspection is journaling, reflecting on what I hear, and then go backwards and forwards. So that's sort of the digging deep part. What also I think all of us can get better at is focus and saying no, having the humility to know that I can not do everything, but I can do almost anything I put my mind to. That actually requires humility, right? To say no, and no, I can't do this, and I don't want to do it. So that's the digging deep piece, the self-awareness. The leading relationally, my favorite there is tough on results and tender on people. So I can build meaningful collaborative relationships with my team members while holding them to the highest standards. During my peacekeeping mission in Kosovo, my commanding officer opened a meeting he had with me with these words. He said, Urs, I love you. You know I do, and your work is not even close to being good enough. His words made me shrink in my chair. And, I turned myself. He was right, by the way. The work was not not even close. But his words made me shrink. But here's the deal. If he would have yelled at me, if he would have chewed me, I would have tuned him out. It's just another high-ranking idiot officer like I. But he didn't just say he loved me. I know he did because we developed this relationship, and he was, very interested in my career path. He wanted to help me to get to the next level. Because of all that, I was really able to hear his feedback and take it on board. So that's tough on results and tender on people, leading relationally. What also I tie in there is this notion of full transparency, and we might talk about vulnerability in a little bit. But as the leader, being transparent not only about the business goals, the strategy, because, let's be clear, we can never over communicate. We always think when we're in a leadership position that our people know what's going on because we said it a million times. You got to hammer it away 150 times, 7 different ways until you can't hear yourself communicate the same message again, until you hear it paraphrased back to you, and only then do you hear it. So being fully transparent around your goals, your strategy for the team, for the business, and at the same time owning your shortcomings with vulnerability. Again, a peacekeeping example, I had a commanding officer this was in the Middle East. She opened an after-action review with these words. She said, "I screwed that up, and I know it. And here's what I'm going to do that's never happening again." Her ability to go first, owning her mess ups, that made it safe for all of us, her direct reports, to do the same. So she modeled leading with vulnerability so that we can all share our own mistakes and what we did well. So that's the sort of the full transparency. And then the last shift I talk about, which also is leading relationally, but of course on an organizational level, is this notion of a fearless culture, of a psychologically safe culture, where unsurprisingly I rely heavily on the great research by Amy Edmondson out of Harvard, and showing that psychological safety, as I mentioned earlier, sets winning teams apart, and it's something that takes quite a bit of time to build, and it can vanish in seconds. So exactly. So I talk about we need to be the watchdog as leaders for psych safety. It's the smallest things, body language, a slight snarky comment can destroy it. So that's the 5 shifts of what I call heroic. You mentioned correctly, where the leader has all the answers, everything flows to the leader, he or she makes all the calls, right, to humble leadership.
And, this idea of growth mindset, not everybody who's listening or watching might know that, but I think it's really important when it comes to humility because, well, maybe I'll let you define it. I think those two are like cousins. In order to be humble, you have to have a growth mindset. And having a growth mindset allows humility to, is evident. So could you speak to growth mindset specifically?
Absolutely. So growth mindset, meaning basically, I know what I know and I can't really, learn and grow. And mainly, and by the way, I'll share something very personal in a second. So a lot of us, are brought up that way. It's all about preserving the facade, looking good from the outside, so we don't admit any mistakes. And then the growth mindset, on the other hand, looks at setbacks, mistakes, and failures as an opportunity for learning and growing, right? And so we're much more open to also talk about the growth mindset. And frankly, for me personally, that has been a huge shift. I was very much brought up in an environment, in a society, in a family that was looking at how do we look, preserving the facade, being perfect. And to be quite frank, I struggle to this day with this notion. So to take risks, to take a lot of risks, and then, to potentially fail and look bad, right? And so that's, and you're absolutely correct. That's sort of also ties something else into the humble leadership concept. I need to be fundamentally confident, actually, in order to show up with a growth mindset and in order to show up with humility. Because only if I'm fundamentally confident that I have a strong sense of self, can I actually take those risks. Can I ask you, give me some feedback on how I'm doing? So can I actually display humility and admit that I'm not perfect because I have mistakes, I have flaws, because I fundamentally have a strong sense of self.
When you look on the world stage right now, we've got Xi Jinping, we've got Putin, we've got Trump, then you've got Elon Musk and all of the tech bros that are now being called, I heard a reference point, the broligarchs, the broligarchs. Um, what do you see there as it relates to radical humility and humble leadership?
So I struggle with that quite a bit, to be totally frank, and honest. The I mean, one thing we could look at is, let's look at Steve Jobs for a second. So Steve Jobs is obviously, or was obviously, not a humble leader, right? And so he had a lot of flaws. He was, though, and people don't know that, he was deeply intellectually humble. He didn't care if his idea won. He wanted the best idea to win. He would sometimes drive people nuts in meetings because he could switch his position just like that. Because he saw somebody had a better idea and he would just on the spot do a 180. So Steve Jobs actually was intellectually incredibly humble. The other piece I would say to this is, okay, there is, you know, arrogance, there is non-humble behavior, and there is success. Okay, there's a correlation. Does that mean there's a causality? Science one-on-one? We can argue that, right? So it might be that some of the world leaders you mentioned, are successful because they don't show up as humble leaders, or despite of that. So can we look at how well, a Trump or some of the other world leaders would do if they weren't humble? But I'm so that's the first thing. The second thing is, let's give it some time. And how do we define success, by the way? That's a whole other notion. Like, how do we define success? And let's give it some time. Let's look in the long run how those less humble leaders actually do. So I would still put forward, despite of some of these examples, and this is then, to be honest, getting outside of my area of expertise, what's going on in the society, that we seem to be drawn to these strong men. Like, what's going on there? Let's unpack there. And honestly, that's probably, yeah, I need to study that some more. So there's obviously something that people are yearning for in the strong males, and I'm not quite clear what that is.
Okay, so I promise we're going to circle back
Sure.
to the IDG and the goals of why the IDG framework was conceived. But I want you to give a moment to make the business case for humble leadership. You have, but I wonder if there's any specific things you could speak to, because often when I talk about purposeful empathy or empathic leadership, I'll get from feedback that sounds amazing, but we're a high performance culture, and
Right.
that's going to get in the way of our success. So I wonder, you're speaking to the converted, and I imagine people who are listening to this podcast or watching this podcast already have an openness to the topic. But could you make it concrete? Like, how does radical humility really matter to the bottom line, or to to people who are working on the team? Like, what's the evidence?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll have, so first I would say there's plenty of academic research, and, go into my book, there's plenty of academic research. Engagement improvement by humble leaders versus non-humble leaders, 85%. Okay, so you want engagement, you want the people who hang around, you're suffering talent shortage, there's your business case. Bottom line results, there's studies out of banking, humble leaders produce 30+% better bottom line results. And so there's rigorous, not by me, but rigorous academic peer-reviewed research that clearly shows that humility doesn't only drive maybe some of the softer metrics like engagement, like retention, but actually all the way translates to bottom line business results. So there's research there, you can find it in my book. But then again, more conceptually, try leading top-down command control, everything going through you today. You're too slow. You're always a step behind if you have everything flow through you. If you don't empower your people to make independent decisions, you'll be too slow. You'll get left behind. And so that's, I made the conceptual case earlier. So that's the business case for humble leadership. And I'm a results guy. Like, don't give me just fluff stuff, right? So, I mean, I have personal experiences during ultra cycling events in the military. Our teams, the teams that were led by humble leaders, we outperform the other teams because my team, I led mainly as a humble leader. My team felt empowered. I could leave. You know, the real leadership, the real test of leadership is how the ship runs when you're not there. I could leave, and my people knew what to do. So there you have it.
There I have it. Okay. You mentioned the word vulnerability earlier, and you said maybe we talk about it some more. So I do. I want to talk about that some more. I wonder if you have any of your own lived experience or examples where you've witnessed or you've heard of um, how important vulnerability is to humble leadership and how it's not a weakness, that we've got to demystify that.
Yeah. So, first of all, when I talk about we need to show up with vulnerability as a leader, it's not about opening every team meeting in tears. And my parents never really loved me. It's not about opening up my darkest secrets or talk about my deepest fears. It can simply be saying things like, "Hey, Anita, I'm not quite sure about this either. What do you think?" Or actually communicating a meaningful personal goal. Like, I want to become a better delegator at work. What suggestions do you have for me? So showing or talking about the meaningful personal goal demonstrates to our team members that we're true work in progress. That's an appropriate level of vulnerability. And so I have a fascinating research study that I think I write in the book, where pairs of complete strangers are brought into a lab and they're tasked with asking each other and responding to meaningful questions for 45 minutes. Questions like, what does love and friendship mean to you? And if you only had 1 year to live, what would you change? At the end of the 45 minutes, participants were asked to rate the level of trust they developed with a partner 45 minutes, and they rated the level of trust about as high as the average level of trust they have with people in their lives, some even as high as the level of trust they have with significant others. And one pair, I love this, got married. The point is, I know, cool, right? Even sharing, even for short periods of time, with appropriate vulnerability is one of the quickest ways to build trust. I mean, another example, Brad Smith is the former CEO of the financial technology company Intuit. So he volunteered. This is well before the little corporate scandal they had about the free, not free software last year. He volunteered to his board to do a 360. I assume most of your listeners and viewers know a 360 anonymously surveys everybody around you around your strengths and weaknesses. So he volunteered. He didn't have to do it. He then shared his 360 with every single person in the company. He emailed his 360 report, including his action steps, to every single person down to the last intern. He even taped a copy to his office door. And in the process, he built humongous trust. Because you know what? If the top dog admits that he's not perfect and wants to get better, maybe I can do the same thing. So that's how appropriate levels of vulnerability can build trust. A caveat here. It's not always called for. If there's questions about your technical ability to do the job, number one, or number two, if you are brought into a very top-down command control, everybody's just, keeping the perfect facade environment, you might not want to lead out of the gate with vulnerability. So this is why leadership is a thinking person sport, right? You got to read the situation and then display appropriate levels of vulnerability. And the other piece you can do, you can start within your team. Right? We always have so much more control than we think because we have control, if we're in a leadership position, what's going on in our team, regardless of what's going on outside.
Okay, so before the book lands in the mailbox or before the person gets to the store to buy the copy of Radical Humility, what are some concrete things that they can learn to do before their book gets in the mail to learn humility? Yeah.
I like to keep this super simple, and I think I shared this already. Start asking for feedback from your teammates on how they see you, on how you're doing. This is so simple, and nobody does it. Do it every week during your one-on-one. At the end of the meeting, ask, "Hey, Anita, what can I do better to be your manager? And what do I do well?" And do it every week so you train the feedback muscle so it doesn't become this scary thing you do once every 6 months. That's the first thing I would do. And the second piece, coming back to the vulnerability, sharing meaningful, opening the door a little bit, sharing a meaningful personal goal, for example, with your teammates, deepening relationships. Relationships deepen through conversations. So lean out the window a little bit and go a little bit deeper than you normally would. Push yourself a little bit to deepen relationship with your teammates. So those two things.
Asking for regular feedback from the people you work with. Okay, so let's talk about outside of the organizational setting. Can radical humility also improve relationships at home? Like with your children, with your spouse, with your
Yeah,
kids?
I mean, it transcends. Like look, I have many flaws, many things I suck at that I'm not good at. But one thing I do regularly is ask my teenage boys. I have a 17 and a 19-year-old. What can I do better as your dad? What do you think works well? What doesn't work well? Absolutely, we can do this with our significant others. It transcends, no question about it. And the same with sharing with the vulnerability. And by the way, the one thing I would say though, there is, leadership is not a popularity contest, and leadership in your personal life, right? Simply because I ask for feedback from my children doesn't mean I act on everything that they tell me I don't do well, right? So I always ask, I always listen, I always thank, but I decide what I'm acting on and what I'm not acting on. So absolutely, it can be applied in your personal life as well.
So I'm listening to you talk, I think it's amazing that you do that with your children. And I'm going away this weekend with my family. I'm gonna ask the question of my daughter. She's 9, like, what could I do better? And my husband and I'm sure we've kind of had those dialogues before. But that it almost assumes a degree of wholeness of the person that can take the feedback. So I'm imagining people who may have endured a childhood where there was neglect or a lot of criticism or worse, or lots of stress that may have triggers around shame if they hear feedback that it's hard to integrate because they have to protect themselves from it. So, what would be the step before that? If you want to be a more humble leader and you're ready for feedback and you want to grow, you want to lean into your growth mindset, but you're still a little bit wounded as a human being. Do you have any advice?
I think we all are wounded,
Mm.
frankly. I mean, we all have our baggage. So I'm not a mental health expert, but you know that requires us to work on ourselves, and I have to work on this. I think most people have to. So that's one thing I would say. So, and then the less or the tougher response to this is that the soft stuff is not soft. The soft stuff is tough, exactly because of what you're mentioning, right? So then I would, say that, this is now not in our personal lives, but if we want to be in leadership positions, we need to be able to take it to some extent, right? And we need to work on ourselves so that we're in a position to, when I say take it, like take it in a constructive and meaningful way without totally falling apart and beating ourselves up because of what we heard, 4 months ago during a feedback session. So I'm not sure I have a great answer to what the first step is before that, other than doing the deep, meaningful personal work that we can heal and that we can become, I never say whole, but wholer, like on the path to get there, right? So that we then can take that feedback in and truly hear it.
Terrific. Penultimate question, Urs. And I'm going to circle back to the IDG framework here. So, why do you suppose humility is so important for inner transformation to achieve the outer change in the world? In other words, like, why does being humble matter for the change that we want to see out there?
If you want to change the world, you have to change yourself. And then when you change yourself, you can start changing the people around. Not you can't, you can start influencing and making a difference in the people around you. And then that's how you change the world, bottom up. So and it's true for anything. It's not just humility. It's any change we make internally, I strongly believe will be projected out into the world. And that's how we change the world.
Mm, be the change. Yes, Gandhi got it right.
Right, you did. Yeah, absolutely.
So the last question I ask of all my guests, and I love ending this way, since this is a podcast devoted to empathy, I wonder if you would share a moment in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
about 12, 13 years ago, I was sort of at the pinnacle of my executive coaching career. I was decent successful. I was also a Vistage chair. And so a Vistage is a CEO peer group. And that was a big honor to be taking over that group, or those, that was actually three groups. And I just took them over. And shortly afterwards, I experienced a pretty dramatic health challenge that basically put me into a wheelchair and made me unable to function at all outside of the house. So I had to stop work immediately. So this is weeks after I took over these three groups, which was a big honor. And they chose me. It was a whole process and whatnot. And so, I felt guilty. I felt ashamed. I felt like a lot of very unpleasant emotions. So when I communicated to these members about my health condition and that I have to, unfortunately, just after a few weeks of taking over, have to step down and step away, the level of understanding, the level of empathy I received from these group members who went through this whole process of selecting me, and there's a whole Shazam and a whole song and dance and whatnot, I will never forget. And so what it meant to me is that I'm more than my professional self. I'm more than, the successful executive coach or Vistage chair or whatever. Like, I actually matter to these people as a human being. And so that was one of the more amazing examples of being on the receiving end of empathy.
And you said something so beautiful. I always get a little bit choked up when I hear these stories. I never know what I'm going to hear. I love asking the question because the frame you used was, what was it? I felt more, you said something like, I felt like a real human being. I felt more than just the task or responsibilities that I had been assigned in this role. And I think that's what empathy affords us, is that I come back to, it's not really a definition, but I say that empathy is the innate trait that unites us in our common humanity. So they showed you empathy and you felt whole in your complexity and appreciated and uplifted by these people. And I love that because it meant something to you. And I think everyone can think of a time when empathy was extended and what it meant. And it's just a reminder, as everybody's listening, getting off this podcast, going on with their day, I'm just planting the seed that we can all turn up the volume of empathy in our lives, and the ripple effects are far and wide. Right?
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah.
Well, it was an amazing conversation about humility. I urge everybody to pick up a copy of your book, Urs. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for the time you've taken to chat today.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
And we will see everyone next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who'd benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Post the link on your socials and hit the subscribe button now. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.